Welcome to the Responsible Negotiation Podcast, produced by the DC Mediation and Dispute Resolution Institute. I am your host, Francis Ojok. Here at the Institute, we prevent, manage, resolve, and transform conflict into an opportunity for positive change using mediation and other appropriate dispute resolution mechanisms. Through our tailored workshops and mediation skill trainings and certifications, we equipped you with the tools necessary to become an effective conflict resolver or a certified mediator. Are you ready to become the change you want to see in your community or in your workplace? If so, visit our website to learn more or contact us at info@dcmediationinstitute.com and let us know how we can work with you or collaborate with you. Without further ado, let's get to the show.
Welcome everyone. In light of the 21st of September, which was International Peace Day, today's presentation is going to be on the question, is war an inevitable part of human nature? I'm going to go through the whole presentation and then we can go through questions in the end. So today's agenda, first we're going to talk about some conflict resolution theory. Then we will cover the Seville Statement on Violence, its 5 propositions and criticisms. Then we will go over mediation and how it can lead to creating a culture of peace. And we will end with some concluding remarks. So let's begin with some conflict resolution theory. First, what is conflict? Conflict is when 2 or more individuals or groups pursue mutually incompatible goals. It is an inevitable aspect of human interaction. Conflict itself is neutral. It can become positive or negative. Positive or constructive conflict is when conflict is managed well, leading to a positive, mutually beneficial outcome. It can lead to growth, improved teamwork and solidarity, deeper understanding within teams. The issues at hand are discussed and addressed productively. It leads to thorough exploration of a greater range of possible solutions, results in many diverse perspectives from being considered, and there is greater potential for innovation. Negative or destructive conflict, on the other hand, is when conflict is not managed well, leading to escalation, aggressive behavior, bullying, fighting, and even violence. This is the breakdown of cooperation. It creates an unhealthy environment. It distracts from addressing the problems at hand. It is confrontational and can even be dangerous. At its lowest scale, it destroys morale and has negative psychological impact on participants, but at its greatest scale, it has resulted in some of the cruelest deeds perpetrated by mankind. Therefore, as we can see, since conflict is neutral, when conflict becomes negative, it can lead to war. And when it becomes positive, it can lead to peace, if we look at the 2 extremes. And all of this depends on how it is managed. Continuing with some conflict resolution theory, now we will cover the concepts of positive peace and negative peace, and these will be important later in the presentation. First, positive peace is addressing the root causes and drivers of conflict, including structural, political, sociocultural, social well-being, economic, and environmental factors. Negative peace, on the other hand, is the absence of violence. It is when root drivers of the conflict have not been addressed. It is likely to lead to a relapse of violence in the future. War has plagued humanity for millennia. Therefore, it is often assumed that war is an inevitable part of human nature, and there may seem to be little that counters that claim. However, a study done by scientists in the 1980s may be the beginning of challenging this preconceived notion. And this is the Seville Statement on Violence. The Seville Statement on Violence is a document which was written and signed in 1986 by an interdisciplinary international committee of scientists. It states that it is scientifically incorrect to say that war is an inevitable part of human nature, and it does so through 5 propositions, which we will cover in this presentation. It was written for the UN-sponsored International Year of Peace and was adopted by UNESCO in 1989. The statement itself does not demonstrate scientific evidence, but is based on the most recent scientific research of the time, and this research is that of the signatory scientists and of other professionals. Now, before we go into the statement, these are some questions that are not addressed in the statement, in the Seville Statement on Violence. The statement does not address factors that cause war. For example, it does not talk about structural, political, historical, or other factors. It does not talk about colonialism. Also, it does not address the factors that cause institutional or structural violence, which is violence committed by structures and social systems, including inherently discriminatory legislation, the police, structures of racism and gender inequality, and more. The statement also does not address the gray area between biological and cultural causes of violence. Our biology is very complex, and there are causes of violence which are both biological and cultural. Those two aspects can overlap. And finally, the statement does not address the relationship between struggle and violence. For example, when there is discrimination or inequality, people might use violence to fight for their rights. All these questions are very important, but as a first step, the Seville Statement on Violence addresses whether war is inevitable because of our biology or not. And this element is also what we will focus on in this presentation. Now let's go through the 5 propositions. The first proposition of the Seville Statement on Violence states that it is scientifically incorrect to say that we have inherited a tendency to make war from our animal ancestors. It says that only a few cases of intra-species fighting between organized groups have ever been reported among naturally living species, and none of these cases use tools as weapons. The statement argues that predatory feeding is not the same as organized intra-species violence, and in this sense, warfare is a uniquely human phenomenon. The scientists reviewed studies on animal aggression, which showed that inter-colony conflicts of ants, wolves, monkeys, and chimpanzees did not involve institutionalization, verbal coordination of behavior, or tools used as weapons. Also, how wars are fought has drastically changed over time, which points to cultural evolution rather than biological evolution. For example, the nature of military organization and the complexity of weapons has evolved exponentially over time. This means that war is to a great extent a product of culture. What the scientists are alluding to here is that if this was biological evolution, we would see a much smaller variation in what war would look like over time. Also, some cultures have not engaged in violent conflict for centuries, while others frequently do. And in many societies, war has existed in one century, but not in the next. This shows that even though war is biologically possible, it is not inevitable. The second proposition states that it is scientifically incorrect to say that war or any other violent behavior is genetically programmed into our human nature. It says that while genes are involved at all levels of nervous system function, they provide a developmental potential that could be actualized only in conjunction with the ecological and social environment. This means that even though genes influence our behavior, they do not single-handedly determine how we react to conflict. The statement says that except for rare pathologies, genes do not produce individuals necessarily predisposed to violence, and neither do they determine the opposite. The vast majority of human beings do not have genetics that make them inherently violent, that is, before social context comes into play. In other words, violence, and in addition war, are not phenomena that are determined solely by our genetics. Even though we are capable of violence, we are also capable of nonviolent action and cooperation. Behavior geneticist Benson Ginsberg and psychologist Bonnie Frank Carter showed that scientific research on mice, dogs, and wolves shows that their behavior is influenced by, but not directly determined by, genetic inheritance. Reactions to conflict are not determined by genes alone, but are greatly influenced by nurture and social context. This means that with the right social conditioning, psychological healing, and conflict resolution training, humans would be well equipped to manage feelings or situations that may lead them to acting violently. Moving on to the third proposition, it says that it is scientifically incorrect to say that in the course of human evolution, there has been a selection for aggressive behavior more than for other kinds of behavior. The statement says that in all well-studied species, status within the group is achieved by the ability to cooperate and to fulfill social functions relevant to the structure of that group. This means that cooperation within social species is a much more useful characteristic and favored over aggressive behavior. This has been proven by studies on animals. In studies where artificially created hyper-aggressive animals were presented in a social group, they either would disrupt the social structure or would be driven out. Often, people who argue that stronger individuals are favored by natural selection over their weaker counterparts greatly emphasize the tendency for self-centered behavior. They confuse the term fittest in survival of the fittest with the term strongest. They often overlook that cooperation is actually very important and that it makes you fit in the case of survival of the fittest. Cooperation has been key to the survival of humanity. Also, it has been found that in animal species who live in social groups, aggressive behavior is selected within the context of cooperation and mutual assistance. For example, using violence to achieve a social goal, such as granting a group a higher status or position of power, would be much more favored socially than the behavior of an individual who is purely strong or violent. Moving on to the fourth proposition. The fourth proposition states that it is scientifically incorrect to say that humans have a violent brain. It says that while we do have the neutral apparatus to act violently, it is not automatically activated by internal or external stimuli. This means that humans don't automatically become violent because of a stimulus. Rather, it is within a social and cultural context that we act. How we act is shaped by how we have been conditioned and socialized. And there is nothing in our neurophysiology that compels us to react violently. Psychologist David Adams showed in his research on mice and cats that even in these animals, whose behavior is simpler than that of primates and humans, the brain mechanisms of aggression don't get automatically triggered by stimuli. Their trigger depends on social context. For example, the extent to which another animal is familiar. This is also the case for humans. For example, if a sibling does something that is annoying, we would react differently than we would if a stranger did the exact same action. Moving on to the fifth proposition, it states that it is scientifically incorrect to say that war is caused by instinct or any single motivation. Modern war involves the institutional use of psychological conditioning, which includes characteristics such as obedience, suggestibility, which is taking into account the suggestions of others, and idealism. People are trained and taught to think and act a certain way to make war work. In addition, modern war uses social skills such as language and rational thinking, such as planning and cost calculation and information processing. Combatants are trained, and the population is prepared to hate an enemy through media, propaganda, etc. Generals, soldiers, political leaders, and others are just workers. They act according to the mission and duties of their roles, and not necessarily on aggressive instinct. Seville signatory and psychologist Rita Wallstrom has shown in her research that the enemy image is an artificial construction, not a constant human trait. This means that war is a structure and a creation, not a biological reaction to stimuli or something made because of instinct. War also is not caused by any single motivation, meaning that it contains many layers of causes which interact to create this complex phenomenon. Now we will move on to some criticisms of the Seville Statement on Violence. One of the main criticisms of the Seville Statement on Violence is on the basis that it says that violence is not in our genes. This has been interpreted as violence being completely a social construct and not in our biology at all. For example, Azar Gat, in his article, argues that both war and peace are in our genes and that, quote, people can cooperate, compete peacefully, or use violence to achieve their objectives, depending on what they believe will serve them best in any given circumstance, end of quote. In this interpretation, violence is one category of tools that humans can use to achieve objectives, so it is within our nature to use violence to advance our objectives. However, in my understanding, this is supported by the Seville Statement on Violence, because it says that even though we are capable of violence, we can also be taught and trained to not use it. And as we saw earlier, the Seville Statement on Violence has said that violence and war are biologically possible, but not inevitable. This implies that we do have the genes that make it possible for us to act violently. However, we don't have genes that make it inevitable that we act violently. In other words, we have the ability to decide how we act, which is also determined by our upbringing and social context. The conclusion of the Seville Statement on Violence, therefore, is that biology does not condemn humanity to war. This is important to know so that we feel empowered to undertake the transformative tasks needed for world peace. These tasks are mainly collective and institutional, but the mindset and motivation of individuals determine their completion. And to quote the Seville Statement on Violence, just as wars begin in the minds of men, peace also begins in our minds. The same species who invented war is capable of inventing peace. Now, what does this mean? This means that we can create a culture of peace the same way we created a culture of war. And this brings about the question, how do we create a culture of peace? One way to create a culture of peace would be to commonly use processes which manage conflict positively. Remember, positive conflict means that conflict is managed well. If these processes were to become a social norm, parties in conflict would default to working through conflict productively and collaboratively, as opposed to defaulting to fighting. As we can see in the graph from earlier, if conflict is managed well, it becomes positive conflict, which can then lead to peace. One of the processes with this great potential is mediation. Mediation is a process which guides disputing parties through positive conflict resolution. It therefore has the potential to shift human culture from a culture of war into a culture of peace. It is a process of alternative dispute resolution, where an impartial third party, the mediator, helps structure the conversation and negotiation of disputing parties. It works because of its principles: self-determination, meaning that the parties make their own decisions; voluntariness, meaning that parties engage in the process out of their own free will; confidentiality, so the parties can feel secure that their information will not be shared outside of the mediation. This allows them to feel more comfortable to explore a greater range of options; impartiality, meaning that the mediator does not pick sides; open-ended, so the process can change to adapt to the changing needs of the parties; and structured. This process provides a structure for the conversation and negotiation at hand, This is useful because it serves to guide parties through a difficult situation. And to demonstrate what mediation looks like, here is the diamond mediation model. The process begins with the mediator giving an opening statement, where they talk about the process, what the party should expect, and any ground rules. Then, each party gives an opening statement, talking a bit about the situation, what they're looking for, and this leads to a two-way conversation where there is issue exploration, agenda setting if needed, and as the mediation continues, there is the negotiation phase where parties discuss possible solutions. The mediation ends with an agreement or an impasse if there's no agreement. And at any point in the mediation, parties have the option to speak with the mediator confidentially without the presence of the other party, and this is called a caucus. So how can mediation lead to a culture of peace? The global normalization and common use of processes such as mediation would first get parties to the table. This is important because it is a first step to any successful conflict resolution. Second, it would mean that choosing to manage conflict in a way that makes it positive would be the social norm. People would choose to work towards win-win solutions over wanting to defeat the other party. This is a shift in the mindset. In addition, mediation is a process which addresses the roots of the conflict by managing the underlying feelings and needs. By acknowledging feelings, mediators make parties feel heard, preparing them to collaborate. Behind each conflict and the consequential negative feelings, there are unmet needs. These needs could be material, social, or psychological. For example, a need could be the need to feel appreciated or the need for a higher salary. Addressing feelings and needs is important no matter the scale of the conflict because every conflict involves human beings. In addition, mediation also improves communication and relationships. This is important because good communication and the improvement of relationships can make or break collaboration towards beneficial solutions. Mediation improves communication between parties because it teaches them how to talk with each other. The mediator uses techniques which make both parties feel heard, demonstrating good listening skills, and also introduces structure so that the conversation is productive. This, therefore, also leads to the improvement of relationships. When communication between people is improved, they are more likely to cultivate empathy and understanding, which improves their relationship. And now, for some concluding remarks. Remember the concept of positive peace? Positive peace is addressing the root causes and drivers of conflict, including structural, political, sociocultural, social well-being, economic, and environmental factors. As we can see, there are other aspects of conflict that must be addressed in order to create a world with positive peace. To have positive peace, conflict resolution processes such as mediation are invaluable tools because they address the root causes of conflicts. It is infinitely important for people to have the essential tools for resolving conflict. So making the use of techniques such as mediation the norm would transform our global society into one that chooses cooperation before choosing to fight. However, even though expanding the use of mediation and other alternative dispute resolution processes would be an incredible second step, the first step being challenging our learned beliefs on the nature of war, it will not be enough. As the Seville Statement on Violence says in its fifth proposition, war is greatly institutional. It is a structure that has been built with combatants and other participants being trained workers who are acting rationally rather than by instinct. This means that in order to create a world with positive peace, we must address the faults of the structures and institutions that uphold wars. Among other initiatives, this would mean complete decolonization, reparations to the global South and diaspora communities, and transforming our institutions to uproot racist and other discriminatory norms and policies. It would mean addressing poverty, protecting indigenous communities, and safeguarding the environment. This said, I invite you all to the practice of radical imagination, where it is encouraged to leave the box of thinking that we have been taught since we were children, and to imagine what kind of a world we can create. We each have the great potential to influence our community, our society, and the world. Global peace can be cultivated, and we possess the tools to make this into a reality. We also have to keep in mind that peace is an active process, not an end state. And, as the Seville Statement on Violence says, the responsibility to invent peace lies with each of us. That is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Vivara, for that insightful presentation. At this point, we would love to invite anybody in the attendance who have any question for clarification from our very own presenter, Vivara.
Yes, Lois.
So I really liked, I was writing down questions when you were talking, and then you went ahead and answered a lot of them as in your presentation. So you did a great job of kind of guiding us through. I love the term radical imagination. And I'm curious how that got added. That I think that's fascinating.
Sure. Yeah. I first learned about the term with climate activism. It's essentially, it means to leave the box of thinking that we have been taught, essentially, and to put those barriers down so that we can imagine what is possible. It's a term used by activism, I think.
Apparently, I'm not around enough activists, so thank you.
No problem.
Any more questions?
Well, I mean, I have another question. If you
Yeah, go for it.
I'm really curious about, because I had been thinking, how do we change the culture? And you started by talking about the normalization and just getting parties to the table. So getting parties to the table is such an interesting idea. In obviously where we are, judges are getting people to the table of mediation. How else are you imagining we start to get more people to a table where they can cooperate?
Mm-hmm. I think involving mediation in public policy, I think that gets people to the table, but also promoting and teaching people and so that they understand what mediation is and how it can be beneficial, and then kind of making that into the social norm, what people would go to first out of choice because they know what it is and they know its benefits.
Just to add a little bit on what Vivara has said, at DC Mediation and Dispute Resolution Institute, part of the things that we want to do with this webinar series is to make the information about mediation available to everyone. The biggest challenge that we see is lack of that information. At time when we reach out to the community, telling them about mediation, you will be surprised. Most of them will be like, I do not need meditation, So that in itself, in my opinion, explained how much work needs to be done. And I believe that in order to, take everyone from where we are to where we envision to go, it's going to be a collective effort.
So much of what Vivara said really applies to things that I'm thinking about and trying to work with, because many of the juveniles that I'm working with really don't see an alternative to solving problems with peers other than physically fighting.
Exactly.
So, right. We're just constantly working on the process and helping them understand conflict and ways to resolve and better communication skills. But I really liked your concepts of positive peace and negative peace. I think that really ties in, because just choosing not to fight, but then not addressing the issue doesn't really get them anywhere. Vivara, we're so proud of you. This is just amazing work you're doing.
Well, if we do not have any more questions, allow me to thank Vivara one more time for our insightful presentation. Here at DC Mediation and Dispute Resolution Institute, we believe that the quality of our life does not depend on not having conflict. The quality of our life depends on how we handle those conflicts. And we do believe that each and every disagreement should not lead to any violent interaction. It boils down to communication. How do you communicate and get to see the other side's perspective? And I believe that with much information such as this, we will be in a position to empower each and everyone to handle the disagreement in a more humane way. And I believe that will be the key towards having the kind of world that we do want to see. That being said, if anybody in or among us here have, say, topics that he or she want to present on, we are constantly looking for presenters to present in our bi-weekly webinar series. I thank you all so very much. And at this point, allow me to officially bring our session to an end.